Well, welcome to our Travels Through Time YouTube page. Today we have what I hope is a bit of a treat for you. It's a conversation between me and a very interesting historian, Felipe Fernández-Armesto. He's going to be taking us back a little bit more than 500 years to have a look at Magellan and to see the year that he thinks is the most significant of them all.
So I'll start off, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, by welcoming you to Travels Through Time. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you today. And hopefully we've got a nice little hour's conversation in front of us. I'm going to start with your book, which I've been reading over the last week or so. It's a fascinating bit of history. We're now in 2022 reaching the 500th anniversary of a very significant milestone, one of the great voyages from the golden age of exploration, the so-called Magellan expedition, which departed from near Cadiz in Spain in 1519 and returned 500 years ago in 1522. Now, in all popular memory, this is remembered as an astonishing success. It was the first circumnavigation of the world. Magellan found the strait, which is named after him. He entered the Pacific Ocean, he crossed the ocean, and he found the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands, at the other side, then returned to Spain around the Cape of Good Hope. It's all like kind of a story of great success, surely. But you start your book by exploding this myth to some extent. You cast it much more in kind of Dunkirk terms as a noble failure. So I thought that was the best place to start. If you could tell us a little bit about this idea of the Magellan voyage.
Thank you for your welcome, Peter. I assure you the pleasure's all mine. It's a great treat to be with you. And thank you very much for what I can only interpret as a very benign plug for my new book.
I can do a less benign one if you like. It's right here in front of me. Yes. So this is the book in question. Very interesting.
But of course, yes, I mean, there's no point in being anything except a myth-buster if you're trying to be an historian, because you just confirm what people already think. You might as well not have bothered researching in the first place. And I myself was rather surprised, I suppose, by the extent of Magellan's failure, because his reputation for success really derives from a literary tradition which started shortly after his death, as a mythopoeic romanticization of his life. And you use the phrase noble failure. And I think in many ways he was an ignoble failure, because very extraordinary, isn't it, that nowadays the worst thing that can happen to you is to be a dead white male explorer, because then people hate you, they tear down their statues, they revile your reputation, they besmirch your renown. But in Magellan's case, he's escaped all that, in spite of being actually, one of the nastiest of those explorers whose crimes included murder, judicial murder, rapine, mayhem, arson, treason. And yet, in spite of all that, he still has this great reputation. And when you add to that the extent of his failure, he failed in every declared objective of his voyage, both those suggested by the King of Spain, his patron, and those which he set for himself, which are often very different from those that the king wanted. And he didn't succeed in any of them. And the supposed, redeeming feature that most historians, and all previous historians, have accepted is that the voyage made a profit in crude material terms. It didn't. It made a very substantial loss if you take all the accounts into consideration. And perhaps, the most surprising thing is that it contributed nothing to the scientific understanding or the geography of the time. It didn't, Magellan himself didn't circumnavigate the world. He never made it to the Spice Islands. He died before he got there. And if you, look at the sort of crude balance of success and failure, he lost one of his ships, his own life, and those of almost all of his men. Now, to say nothing of the devastation inflicted on some of the indigenous societies with which he interacted, of his own crew, the death rate, if you take out all the people who deserted or fell into enemy hands, the death rate was 90%, which was, pretty big death rate, even for these fantastic voyages of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. So I don't know, you put all that together, to me, that's a pretty unquestionable record of failure.
So do you think, so implanted in that answer is the riddle, why then do we continue to revere a voyage that had such marked failures as you described there? Was it the case that because he died, he left himself a kind of martyr to this age of exploration when they needed a hero? You say before, he's in a way in this kind of post-colonial age that we now live in, he's the most congenial figure that you can find. It's no Columbus. He's not like Da Gama or even some of the later ones that came. Magellan has had his name put on the side of NASA rockets and even anything connected with that voyage. I used to live in Madrid when I was younger, and I remember Juan Sebastian Elcano. He would have his name was on streets and metro stations and bars, and it seemed like there was a kind of lustre to the whole voyage, which has continued to light up over the centuries. What is that lustre?
Well, you make a very good point. I mean, I think the reputation of Elcano is in Spain is a slightly different sort of phenomenon. But in the case of Magellan, I think you hit on an absolutely vital aspect of this when you mentioned the moral effect of his death. We now know, from the examples of Elvis Presley and guys like that death can be a great career move. And it was in Magellan's case, because by the time he died, I think he'd really abandoned all hope of the sort of material rewards, the social ascent that he was hoping would be his be the outcome of his endeavors for himself. He knew that the best that could happen to him if he ever got back to Spain was that he'd be tried for treason. He probably had his head chopped off. They really, he was at the end of his career. And my view is that he deliberately contrived the way he died to make it seem as heroic and romantic as possible. Indeed, I think I tried to show in the book that he modeled his death very consciously on that of the great chivalric hero of the Middle Ages, Roland, who died because he was too proud and too brave to summon aid in a battle in which he was doomed. And I think Magellan was quite deliberately following that pattern. And it worked. I think that his death created this tremendous resonance. And of course, in certain cultures, I think in Britain, where we're having this conversation, people do have a sort of sentimental attachment to failure. The British love the Dunkirk spirit. And in my own country, in Spain, there's a sort of similar reverence for failure. The famous Spanish saying says, honor without ships is better than ships without honor. and there are other cultures, Japan's another culture where this sort of sense of the grandeur of failure, the heroism of failure is very strong. I mean, the final thing is that Magellan had a stooge to write it all up for him. Remember, Winston Churchill said that he wasn't afraid of the judgment of history because he was going to write it himself. And Magellan wasn't up to that, but he did have a great writer to do it for him. He had Antonio Pigafetta, Vincentian gentleman who sailed with Magellan and who was under his thrall and who was really responsible for the nation that this voyage.
Is he kind of like almost like a Boswell to Johnson character? Is it that kind of sense of adjuration from a chronicler that he had, which is very useful?
Yes.
We'd all like one of those.
Yes, yes, you could say that he was his Boswell, although, of course, alas, we can't reconstruct the details of the relationship in the same details you reconstruct that of Boswell and Johnson.
I should ask you at this point, just for our listeners who are not familiar with the manner of Magellan's death, could you tell us how he did die? Just to clarify that one, please.
Sure. Well, the common belief that he was heading for the Moluccas is false. Those are the king's orders. But Magellan was very focused on going to the Philippines and trying to create a sort of fief, a kind of lordship for himself there, because those islands he knew were rich in gold. They were very close to China, which was a place everybody wanted to trade with. And he also knew they were politically very divided, so there was an opportunity to kind of play off one ruler against another. And that's what he tries to do when he gets there, but he backs the wrong ruler, and he finds himself committed to battle against other more powerful of the local kinglets amongst whom the islands were divided. So he goes into battle against one of the most powerful of them, the king of Mactan. And he's got a very small force. He is hugely outnumbered. And he almost deliberately contrives to fight the battle in the worst possible place. Napoleon pointed out that the most important thing when you're fighting a battle is to choose the best terrain for yourself. And Magellan almost deliberately chooses terrain that favors the enemy. So he's a long way from his supporting ships. He's beyond artillery range. His men have to wade through the sea to get on shore. They've got to cross all these sort of ditches and trenches that the enemy have prepared, and they're vastly outnumbered. And eventually, when the rest of his men retreat to their ships, Magellan stays there being pounded and pummeled by the missiles of the enemy, surrounded by this sort of handful of his most devoted retainers. So those are the circumstances of his death. And the guy who wrote up the adventure, who was responsible for creating the myth, escapes, barely with his life, with a sort of poisoned missile in his leg, which then swells up whilst he's busily trying to write up the effects of the escapade. So Magellan's body is, kind of abandoned and left on the shore in this sort of pool of salt water riddled with wounds.
Magellan's character, I just want to touch on this before we get into the main matter of what we're going to talk about today, because, of course, it's his personality which infuses the voyage which you write about. And you talk about him being a kind of elusive character in the archive. He's not really... he's not really, I suppose, present in a very obvious way, although he's there. You often point out, and you have managed to construct a picture of him as you describe it, being tragically flawed with his social ambition. He had heroic self-delusion, self-righteousness, and a kind of cruel humor as well. Do you think he was someone who had a sense of destiny? That's kind of maybe a big question, but you get these characters, and I mean, it's kind of like a little Napoleon almost, someone who felt that they had to leave their mark on the world and that they were going to be protected by either fate or by some religious force.
Yes, thank you. Not quite like Napoleon. Napoleon did say, "Quelle remarque ma vie." So, in a sense, they both sort of modeled the trajectory of their lives on fiction. So, to that extent, he was a character like Napoleon. But of course, he belonged in a different era. Magellan, the Enlightenment hadn't happened, the scientific revolution hadn't happened, Romanticism hadn't happened. So he's embedded in a completely different cultural environment from Napoleon. The kind of fiction that Magellan modeled his life on was medieval chivalric romances, tales of knightly daring do. In order to understand him, you've got to understand he was an orphan. He came from a very minor noble family. He was very resentful. He had a chip on his shoulder. He thought his sort of life had denied him his birthright. And he modeled himself, as many of us do, you know, I mean, you don't have to be a bloody intellectual like me, you know, to be influenced by what you read. We all, when we read, we sort of start imagining ourselves in the role of the hero. And that's what Magellan did in his own reading, which was fundamentally in this type of what I call the airport bookstall or station bookstall pulp fiction of the time. And so these are typically, you know, tales of people down on their luck who have adventures and who are sensationally and who end up living happily ever after. And in Magellan's case, it all happened, except the living happily ever after. That's where it all kind of went wrong. So that was the sort of guy he was. But of course, you know, you can't expect somebody to be the same person throughout his or her life. We all change as we go along. And I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book was that previous biographers of Magellan present this very static character. And to me, I can detect the dynamism of his personality as it unfolds, as it's changed by experience, because you can't get on these long, arduous, you know, terrible voyages stuck in these ships with no external communication, sharing your very limited space with a lot of bilge water and rats and people who hate you, and going on for a very long time. In the case of Magellan's voyage, at one point spending 97 days at sea continuously, which I think at the time was a record. You can't go through all that without it changing you. And put it very crudely, I would say the Atlantic made Magellan more ruthless and reckless, and the Pacific made him more religious, until he ends up as a kind of almost sort of slightly, I mean, can I say a fanatical nutcase? Is it okay?
You can call him a fanatical nutcase after spending so long writing about him. You're eminently qualified to do so. And of course, it's a nice way of structuring it between the two oceans, and with that strait in the middle that still bears his name, the Strait of Magellan, that you describe in the book as this kind of tunnel of wind, and the picture of him kind of going down that in that tiny little ship is I think the abiding one of the book. But anyway, let's get on to our main business, because when you write, there's a great sense of you having your story, but also contextual awareness. And this is so important to studies of your period, where sometimes the record is going to leave gaps where you can't get this kind of Boswellian picture that emerges in later centuries that you alluded to. So today, I think a good way of characterizing what we're going to do now is to dive back into the context of Magellan's world. What world was he growing up in? What were its promises? What were its fears and its hopes? And we're going to do that with the Travel Through Time format, which is the 3 scenes and 1 year, and always begins by me asking the provoking question, I hope, that if you could travel back through time to 1 calendar year in the past, which year would you pick?
Well, I think I've picked 1492 because I'd like to talk about it. Whether I'd like to be there, I'm not so sure. I think I'd very much like to be in the first scene that I've proposed to talk about, which is in the home of Zhen, this Chinese painter who has a mystical experience on the night of August the 7th, 1492, and who painted it and wrote about it in a way that makes mysticism very vivid, and also takes us to the heart of the sort of Confucian world that he inhabited in the China of the time. And I think the reason why I chose 1492 is that it's just such a resonant year in which so much happens that recrafts the world in a very sudden and dramatic way, and makes it very much more like the world we inhabit today. There's something sort of recognizable about the world since 1492, which is very different from the world before it. And there are very few years in history about which you can say that the events of that year really transformed the world. And of course, a lot of it is to do with Columbus. The world is transformed by ecologically and culturally, and that's and the reason I suppose for starting in China is that that's where Columbus was going. That's where everybody wanted to go, and it was the sort of top nation, if you like, at the time.
But so you have written a previous book titled 1492 when you deal with this year in more detail, and it's kind of presented as a hinge year, really, between the end of an old world and the start of another world. That's how it's really kind of intriguingly presented to the reader, and it is very true. I mean, you write in that book, divergence began, and this is just to give a sense of the time that we're talking about. Divergence began perhaps about 150 million years ago with the fracture of, now you're going to have to tell me how to pronounce this because I'm going to stumble, I think. The fracture of Pangaea, is that right?
That sounds pretty good to me.
That'll do. The planet's single great landmass that poked above the surface of the oceans. And then from that point onwards, we have this idea of the world maybe separating into different parts. But then the poetic image of, in 1492, this process beginning at least, by which we are going to become a global world, the global world that we know today. I suppose the one that there might be a few people still out there who have not been embraced by this process of globalism, or globalization, should I say, which started all those years ago. But 1492 really is the moment. So I suppose what it gives us an opportunity to do this year is to, of course, see the beginning of something new, but also to look at the end of something old. And I think that's that the encounter between the two is something that seems to really interest you as a historian. Is that correct?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm very intellectually indisciplined, and just about everything interests me. And I think one of the problems that I've always had as a professional historian is that you're not really supposed to be like that. You're supposed to specialize. And I've specialized, I specialize in the way that a serial monogamist is faithful. I've just done one thing after another, like an intellectual flibbertigibbet, and as a result, I've come, in old age, to be able to write about these very, very big subjects. And now, because I'm very old, nobody minds. I'm sort of allowed this indulgence, which younger academics are not permitted. So yes, I am interested in the whole span of that 150 million years. In fact, but in some respects, I think about and write about much longer intervals of time. But it is amazing, isn't it, that something which has had a continuous, sustained pattern for 150 million years as the continents drift apart and different ecosystems, different environments take shape in the various sundered land masses of the world, that process should suddenly go into reverse in a single year. And this long period of what I call divergent evolution between the different parts of the world should be replaced by a model of convergent evolution. Because since 1492, all the life forms, all the biota, all the plants, the animals, the microbes of the world have got more and more like each other, instead of, in the previous 150 million years, getting more and more unlike each other. That's a really stunning change to happen so quickly. And obviously, the other aspect of it is that over a shorter period of time, but still, for many thousands of years, cultures had been diverging around the world. They've been getting more and more unlike each other as they remained out of contact, they adjusted to new environments. In 1492, mainly because Columbus launched a new technique for long-range voyaging, and it was able to reunite the sundered cultures of Europe and the Americas. Since then, that process has also, been reversed, and we've gone on reconnecting with each other's cultures until we've come to inhabit this very globalized, use your word, world that we live in now, where practically every culture is in very close touch with every other culture, and they're all exchanging influences. And again, that's an extraordinary, different world. You know, people before 1492 had been literally incapable of imagining it because there was nothing like it in their experience.
So let's go to China, where you alluded to China before, and this is going to be our first point of contact in 1492. Any idea about time? What kind of time in the year, or is it difficult to say? But really, if you can just elaborate on why you would like to go to China in 1492 and what you would like to see.
No, I can be very specific about this date. It's August the 7th. In our terms, we would call it August the 7th. And we know that because the painter I mentioned, Zhen, he wasn't a professional painter, he was a rich gentleman who lived in retirement and who wrote poetry and who did paintings which were very famous and very esteemed throughout the Chinese world. He signed the painting that he painted on that day, and he ended this sort of fantasy, this reverie that he wrote about his experience of the night, and he dated it. So we can be absolutely precise about this. And he was living in retirement in his private, literary pavilion, surrounded by his books in these rain-swept mountains, and he describes the rain, the sounds that he hears, the distant drum beats, the barking of the dogs, and he paints it. You can see he's this little tiny figure in the midst of all this nature, and he describes his sense of coming to feel at one with all of these sounds and sights that are surrounding him, and how the sort of whole of nature comes to infuse his being, so that he's identified with the world. And that's really an extraordinary mystical experience of the sort that people were increasingly having around the world. It does seem to me that the recorded instances of mystical experience in lots of different cultures that we know about accelerate in the late 15th and 16th centuries. And I think this is, another constituent of the world that we live in now, because although most of us probably think mysticism is a bit weird and we don't go in for it, and very few of us have genuinely had mystical experiences, I think we can all see how the mystical emphasis on the individual, you have a mystical experience because you're focusing all your thoughts inwardly. You're trying to immerse yourself. You're very conscious of your own identity and trying to immerse yourself in something bigger. Nature in the case of Zhen Zhao, God perhaps in the case of a lot of Christian mystics. And that focus on the individual is just so characteristic of our own world. We inhabit a world in which individualism is actually the reigning ideology. People talk about capitalism and liberty and all that, of course, but you can't have those without a sense of the individual. You can't have an economic system that's focused on individual benefit without individualism. You can't have a political system that's focused on the individual voting rights unless you've got a sense of the value of the individual. And I think that mysticism really contributes fundamentally to that in a way that historians and students of literature have not previously sufficiently experienced. And I do think it's another way in which the world of 1492 is part of our world and very different from what had preceded.
And Shanzhu is at once, he's, as you describe it, he was much admired in his time. He was wealthy. He was independent. He didn't need a patron. But does he, apart from being outside of like the clutches of I suppose the common life of the average person, does his vision about China tell us anything? Did that represent, or does it tell us anything about Chinese society? Can we get a glimpse or a sense of it from looking at his work?
Yes, we can get a glimpse of a sense. We don't get a general picture because he was very wrapped up in his own little world with his literary friends and his all-night drinking and painting and composing poetry. And so obviously this is a very refined, sort of socially and educationally high-level world. We do get a sense and a glimpse of what China was like because we get a very Confucian view of the relationship between the individual and the rest of the cosmos, a view in which, you know, things like peace and tranquility and harmony, these are the ideals, these are the virtues that for Zhen Zhao really matter. But if you want to get a sense of what the whole of China was like, I think you've got to compare him with other painters, other Chinese painters of the time. I always think that if you want to know what the past was like, look at its art, you know, because it's the way painters and sculptors and architects and landscape designers represented their world that is, you know, our means of getting into their minds. So I always like to look at the art, and if you compare, I don't know, Zhen Zhao with another famous painter of the time, he wasn't so rich, Wu Wei, he has a completely different picture of his world, which is much more, he focuses on human figures to a much greater extent. As I mentioned in Zhen Zhao, the human may be at the center of the composition, but it's always this tiny speck, you know, surrounded by the vastness of the cosmos. Whereas in Wu Wei, humans are these very dynamic agents. And Wu, although he was also a Confucian, was very influenced by Taoism and to some extent by Buddhism. And you can see Chinese culture in a much richer, more multifarious, more variegated, more pluralistic way, if you take into account his paintings and perhaps there's some others of the time. And then, of course, you know, there's the conventional historian's way of documenting the Chinese past, in this case, you know, the world that surrounded Zhen Zhao by looking at you know, documents and diaries and so on. In my 1492 book, I try to evoke what China was like using the diary of a Korean sailor who was shipwrecked and who traveled quite widely in China and produced a really very intimate and detailed and vivid and exciting portrait of the whole empire. So it is possible to do that. Maybe, I mean, the link that we ought to pursue, because I suppose we've only got very limited time, with the other events of the world in 1492 is via the fact that Columbus was, you know, risking everything to try and get to China, because he came from a poor backwater of the world, which we now call Europe, you know, which now we think of, you know, Europe is where everybody from the rest of the world wants to come to, Europe and the United States. But then it was the other way around. You know, everybody wanted to leave Europe and go somewhere richer. And that meant, above all, China. So Columbus is, you know, at the very moment when Zhen Zhao is having this mystical vision, Columbus is in Spain planning his voyage to China.
Yeah, I know. I think the contrast between the two is one is the restless European on the verge of having this kind of explosive voyage, and then the harmony of the. Because I went and had a look at this. This picture earlier, and it is, I think, harmony and balance and equipoise, all of these like kind of feelings are embedded within it, and it feels so different to, as you describe, Columbus's character there, which is this kind of, you know, full of dynamism and energy and intent and action. But just one last thing I wanted to ask you about China before we move on is really China from the outside and China from Europe. And we know that, like, kind of there was a great sense within Europe of China being the kind of the world's greatest economy, this great mart of commerce, this center of perhaps industry. And I know from your description of the Korean shipwreck diary, it is a lot of that. There's a lot of kind of money sloshing around. And there's a great line in it, I think, where he says, all I could see from the towers was more towers, or something like that. And it's just kind of sense of a really built up landscape. China was where Columbus was hoping to get to, wasn't it? And did it really kind of burn brightly in the Europeans' mind? I know it's like 100 years by this point since any Europeans had kind of really been to China, or documented to have been there at least.
Yes, I think you put all that extremely well, Peter. If you'd thought of writing the book beforehand, I wouldn't have had to bother. But yes, of course, they all wanted to go there. But of course, as you're right, because no one had been there for such a long time, at least not from Europe, they had no idea what it was like. I mean, people often compare the explorers of this period to, space travelers in our own time. But actually, the space travelers know where they're going, and they even have technology, which shows them pictures of it before they get there. Columbus had no idea, what he was going to find. Of course, he didn't find China. He found something even more unexpected. But if he got to China, he wouldn't have been able to recognize it for what he thought it was. Because, put it very crudely, his notion of China was based on Marco Polo, which had been written 200 years earlier. And there had been no letters or anything that reached Europe from China for 100 years before Columbus's departure. And he even, when he left Spain, the king and queen of Spain gave him letters to present to the ruler of China if he ever got there. And these letters were addressed to the Great Khan. And the last time a Chinese ruler had that title had been 1368. It just shows you how out of date they were. So it really was sort of groping in the dark. And to me, I don't know, that sort of enhances the sense of adventure.
It is, and it's a great moment of encounter. If you imagine Chen Zhu in his kind of, I don't know, having his vision, and Columbus turning up and pacing around too. Putting them together is very entertaining, should I say. But let's march on. Let's go to a second scene, because I know we've got a bit more to get through yet. And we're going to leave China well behind. Where would you like to go to next, please?
Well, I thought it'd be good to go to Africa, because I think, if one wants to try and evoke a sense of the world, you want to choose some very different places. And obviously, Africa's always been rather underrepresented in Western historiography for the very good and reasonable reason that we just don't have such good materials to work with in reconstructing African history. But I think it's quite important to have a look at what was happening in Africa, because we kind of think of imperialism as a white vice. And I agree it was a vice. I hate empires, but of course it's not a white vice, it's a human vice. And everybody had empires, and including indigenous native empires in the Americas and Africa. Europeans didn't introduce imperialism to those worlds. They just became another competitor in what were already very fierce and cruel arenas. And in 1492, one of the really startling things that happened, well, there are very startling things. The Christianity penetrates south of the Sahara for the first time with the activities of Portuguese missionaries in the courts of the rulers of the Congo. There's dramatic developments in the only part of Africa that had a long and continuous history of Christianity. That's Ethiopia. But the place I'd like to go to on our travel through time is the River Niger, where at an unknown point somewhere between Gao and Timbuktu, the ruler of one of these great indigenous empires, Soni Ali Bur, dies. Very mysterious circumstances. Most accounts attribute his death to a river accident when he was crossing the River Niger, a huge commerce-bearing, enormously rich river that forms the heart of the Songhai Empire. And his death is a really important moment in the history of the world, even though most people have never heard of it. It's actually very important because his his death inaugurates a power struggle for the throne, which is won by the Islamic candidate, by the Muslim candidate, against the pagan candidate. And that really consolidates what had been a very long trend, which was the penetration of sub-Saharan Africa by Islam. And when Islam takes over this major empire, I think that really represents a point of no return. After that, the supremacy of a pagan kingdom is really irretrievable, and Islam is going to be the predominant religion of the region. Just as at the same moment, further south in the Congo, Christianity is beginning to establish itself. And so we begin to see the world taking on the cultural configurations, the civilizational configurations that we see today, in which Christianity and Islam, and to a lesser extent Buddhism, have become genuinely world religions. They've sort of ruptured their limits. They've burst out of the frontiers of their cultures of origin and have become global. And they've, broadly speaking, they've divided Africa between them. There are all sorts of intellectual problems which arise there. What is it about these religions that enable them to become global in a way that other religions have not? Other religions have remained culturally specific, whereas Christianity and Islam have got this huge, appeal to people in every kind of cultural environment. So it's very difficult to say why that was. We can say when it really sort of definitively happened, when the fulcrum tilted in favor of the sort of world we inhabit now. And I put that down, to the moment when Sonny Ali Bird dies on the upper Middle Niger in 1492.
Let's have the best that 1492 can provide us with in terms of breaking news, because out of your book I've taken the extract of the news of his death. It says, Ali the Great, your master. This is a note that arrived, I imagine, at some kind of center, at the center of the empire. Ali the Great, your master and mine, king of the Songhai, star of the wind, shining sun of our hearts, terror of our enemies, died 10 days ago. Beautiful poetic resonance, isn't it, this? He was on his way back to Gao from an expedition as he was crossing a small tributary to the Niger. Or is that how you pronounce it?
Well, I say Niger. I mean, obviously,
I'm not sure.
The French pronunciation Niger, because it was part of French West Africa. But I never think it matters, how you pronounce it, as long as it's intelligible.
Well, hopefully it's that much. Anyway, a sudden swell arose and carried off our Lord, his horse, his baggage, and his train in the surging waves. The army watched powerless from the shore. I was there. We could do nothing. It all happened so fast. It does have a kind of slightly breathless quality about it, which is nice to take you back to the moment. But could I ask you a little bit about his personality? Because he seems like he was a bit of a tyrant from what I can work out. And tell us a little bit about the empire that he was at the heart of.
Yes, I mean, the honest answer is, of course, we don't know, because the sources about Sonny Ali are very doubtful authenticity, and there isn't an awful lot that's genuinely contemporary. But you can make certain inferences. Although he was formerly a Muslim, I mean, his name was Ali, so that's a bit of a clue. And there's a lot of evidence that he had been circumcised. So he's sort of formally a Muslim, but his behavior and his priorities and his devotional life don't seem to reflect that very strongly. He was very deeply allied with a lot of sort of pagan factions in his kingdom. A lot of his advisors were condemned by Muslims as sorcerers and magicians and stuff. All that means really is that they weren't Muslims. And he rather, in the way that a lot of medieval European kings challenge the church, challenge the clergy, and look for other ways of staffing their administrations and surrounding themselves with allies and helpers. So Sonia Ali sidelined the clerical class, sidelined the teachers and the sages, and to some extent the rich merchants. So he made himself a lot of enemies in the course of this defiance, this attempt really to rule the way he wanted to rule without having to rely on these, potentially competitive, learned and wealthy elites. So you can call him a tyrant if you like. I mean, that's slightly a subjective word. But yes, he was a tyrant in aspiration. He wanted to rule the way he wanted. He didn't want to have to defer to these other parts of the elite of his kingdoms. But call it tyranny, or just call it the normal way in which most rulers want to rule.
So one last question about Ali before we move on again is like the extent of his influence. We're talking about the area surrounding Timbuktu in that part of sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, we talked about Mansa Musa on this podcast not so long ago, maybe a year or so ago. He was in the Mali Empire, which was 14th century. So I suppose there's a connection there. Is this the kind of name that would be familiar to a character like King Ferdinand in Spain, or is that overstating his influence, or is he kind of localized? This is probably a question that we don't know the answer to, but I kind of like to ask it anyway.
He becomes well known to the next generation of Europeans because his fame is diffused in Europe through the work of an ex-Muslim who then converts back to Islam, who works at the papal court and who sort of just publishes a lot of stuff about Africa, African legends and history and so on. But in his lifetime, I don't think there's any record of Sonia Ali being mentioned anywhere in Europe. Mansa Musa, whom you told me you had earlier, I'm sorry I missed that podcast. He was very famous in Europe because in his own lifetime, he became very famous as a result of diffusion of news of great pilgrimage that he made
to Mecca.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Sonia Ali's successor, the Muslim who ends up ruling the empire, Muhammad Turai, also makes such a pilgrimage. So he also gets to be named quite quickly. But in Sonia Ali's case, in spite of, you're right to say, in spite of the importance of his realm, which was huge and also immensely rich because it was the sort of channel, the funnel through which the gold and salt trades of the Sahara and West Africa passed. In spite of all that, his own profile in the Europe of his day seems to have been zero.
Okay, well, that's a good answer to that, and it's fascinating to kind of put these pictures of the world together. We've got one last destination to go in 1492, and I imagine it's the one that would probably have popped into most of our listeners' minds as we began this conversation. So, Philippe, over to you. Where would you like to go for your final and third choice in 1492, please?
Well, I don't really want to go there because it's sort of reluctant, but I just thought you can't talk about 1492 without Columbus. And with that extraordinary moment, according to his own record, it was the 12th of October, when for the first time, Native Americans and Europeans see each other. At least the first time of which we have a record. And it is a most extraordinary encounter, very resonant for the future of the world, because you can date the resumption of these trans-oceanic intercontinental cultural encounters, the resumption of contact between exchange between cultures which had been interrupted for so many thousands of years by the dispersion of humankind across the globe. So really important moment. And also, I think, one of the most misunderstood in history, especially nowadays, when a false idea of what happened has taken over, because we're so used to thinking in these encounters of the white guys, the Europeans, having all the power and determining everything. And to some extent, of course, that's true, because the records that have come down to us of these very early encounters are all the ones written by white men. And we can only get a sense of the perception of the indigenous participants by reading between the lines of the white men's accounts. Nevertheless, of course, natives were by no means, bereft of agency. Indeed, they were in charge. They knew the terrain. They were at home. There were more of them. And indeed, the garrison that Columbus left behind in Hispaniola when he left the New World for the first time were all rapidly massacred. So we mustn't think that the indigenous people didn't have a lot of agency, nor must we think that Columbus approached them, with a very obvious sense of superiority. I think if you actually look at what he says about his own first impressions, they're very conflicting, as you'd expect. We have a tendency to oversimplify them and say, well, Columbus just sort of saw these people as exploitable and potential slaves and so on. That's very far from the truth. He approaches them with awe. He's really surprised. He's very surprised that they're not monstrous. He talks about how, they're just ordinary people like us, and that he sees them in with sort of a revelatory sense of common kinship and belonging, which I think is an amazing achievement for someone looking at people so culturally different and so physically in some ways different from what he was used to. So his response is very sympathetic. And the first thing he notices is they're naked. Which is something which in Europe at the time, was generally speaking a bad thing. If you were naked, that evoked all sorts of negative connotations about how you might be like a beast, or how you might be a heretical Adamite, where people who are supposed to go around naked and practice free love. So of course, you'd see these naked people, and all those negative thoughts would come into your mind. But Columbus also sees this nakedness as a very positive thing, as an evidence of a sort of primitive virtue, sees it as the garb of the golden age, the sort of remote past that classical poets have sung, almost of the nakedness of Adam and Eve, sort of innocent nakedness, dependence on God, like the nakedness of St. Francis. Columbus was a great devotee of St. Francis of Assisi, like the present Pope. St. Francis had stripped himself naked in the public square of Assisi at the beginning of his vocation as a sign of his dependence on God. So Columbus also invokes all those positive things about the indigenous people. And of course, he remains conflicted about them, but we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that people in the 15th and 16th centuries were already behaving like 19th century racists with a sort of full kind of comprehensive notion of their own superiority in their minds. It just wasn't like that.
That's to read history backwards. You've got a really lovely expression when you write about this, and you're trying to pinpoint the location for this moment of encounter. And you say that I think the island that's now called as Watling is the least bad match for what we can work out from his descriptions of the place that he called San Salvador, of course. Look, I'm gonna ask you one last question about this moment, because it's almost too broad, because we could spend all day talking about this moment. But as so much of your work kind of rises out of this cultural and contextual appreciation of the world as a moment, do you look back at the specific moment with Columbus's voyage in 1492 as an immense achievement of human endeavor, or was it kind of a historical inevitability given the conditions of the time and what was happening, or as ever was it a mix of the two?
Yeah, well, obviously, it's never any good asking me, either or, because I always respond like Pooh, Winnie the Pooh, when he was asked, did you want jam or honey on his bread? He always said both. That's always my response to that kind of question. But of course, it was a triumph of human endeavor, in the sense that nobody else had done it. And you can say what you like about Columbus, and who doesn't? And there are all sorts of deficiencies in his character and in his morals. Of course, he was, like all of us, a mixture of virtues and vices. But you've got to give him credit for having the audacity to sail with the wind behind him. There'd been lots of attempts to cross the Atlantic in the 15th century, and they'd all failed. And the reason they failed was they all played it safe. They all sailed into the wind. Very hard thing for people nowadays to understand, because everybody now likes to have the wind, in their sails. But of course, if you do that, and you're going to somewhere, you're going to an unknown destination, you don't know whether you're ever going to get back. So you sail into the wind, because that's the only way you can be sure of getting home. And Columbus had the amazing merit of ditching the sort of safe method and saying, I'm going to sail with the wind. And that was what enabled him, and him alone for the first time, to discover a viable, commercially exploitable route across the Atlantic. And that really did change the world forever. Of course, somebody else would have done it at some time, I suppose. But I never feel that's a very good argument for taking away the achievement of the first person to do it, because it's frightfully easy for me to say, well, you've got a great idea for a podcast, Peter. Of course, I thought of it first, but and I would have been able to do it just as well as you. I could easily say that, but you did it, and I didn't.
There's pubs full of such
let's
people.
Let's give you the credit for that, and let's give Columbus the credit for what he did.
Let's two final questions, and they're both quite quick ones, so they won't detain you very long. First of all, if we're trying to put Magellan into this story in 1492, how old would he have been at that time? Would he have been like kind of a sentient adult by this point?
Well, there's a lot of dispute about his date of birth. I argue for a later date than anybody who's written about him previously, for all kinds of complicated reasons. But I think I don't think he can have been born before 1485. So, I'm going to say he's not more than 7 years old.
So we can imagine him cantering around in some playground somewhere at this point. And
well, alas, probably not, because he was an orphan. We don't know when he was sent to the court of the king for his education, but it may well have been about this time.
Okay, well, we'll leave that one hanging. People can go to the book, of course, to get the fuller picture. And of course, the last question I have to ask you is if you could bring a tangible memento back from the year 1492 to have with you today, perhaps having your writing study as a bit of a talisman, something to encourage you on. Is there anything that you would particularly like to have?
Well, I'm not materially inquisitive. I mean, the experience of being there and seeing these things would be transformative for me, because it's how I spend my life, is trying to, imagine these remote events as accurately as I can, and trying to converse with the dead. In a way, that's the historian's job. You've got these questions in your mind, you interrogate the sources. So actually, if one could literally summon up these guys from the past and really talk to them, that would enhance one's sense of having understood them, which is what I've tried to do in my work. But of course, if you're going to offer me an artifact from 1492, I've got to have one of zhen. I'd ask him when I was interrupting his piece. It's a mystical experience on the night of August the 7th. I'd ask him, could I have a painting to take back with me to the 21st century? And that would be one of my most prized positions. I have got a Chinese scroll given to me by one of my Chinese students hanging in my study. If I could have one from Zhen, that would be the best
Well,
material gift I could have.
Well, I think that's pretty good. Well, listen, this has been fabulous, really, really informative, hugely entertaining. We hopefully spoke a little bit about the book as well as about the tour through 1492, and all that remains for me to say is, Philippe, thank you very much for coming on Travels Through Time.
I hope you enjoyed that. That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Felipe Fernández-Armesto about his new book, Straits, The Myth of Magellan. And of course, having a bit of a tour through the year 1492 as well. There's lots more on this feed if you want to explore some different years from the past, but from me, for now, that's it. Thank you very much for watching.